And now a reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 20. Then God spoke all of these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generations of those who have rejected me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of my name, of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses my name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, your son nor your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people had witnessed the thundering and lightning, and the sounds of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid, and trembled and stood at a distance, and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. This is the story of the people of God. Can you please respond? Thanks be to God.
Pop quiz. How many Beatles were there? The Fab Four, you know them. Okay, so let's count through them to see how many Beatles there were. There were Paul McCartney, there was John Lennon, there was George Harrison, there was Ringo Starr, and Pete Best. There were 5 members of the Fab Four. Crazy, right? Okay, here's another question. This is going to be a softball. How many disciples were there? Jesus Christ had 12 disciples, right? Technically, there were 13. We forget about Matthias or Matthias. After Judas committed suicide, they decided, hey, we still need to have 12 disciples, so they all elected Matthias. Poor guy is the Pete Best of disciples. Poor guy. Now, here's one which you're probably going to catch on now. It's a trick question. How many 10 Commandments were there? Technically, there were 14. Now, to just kind of go through them a little bit here, we think there are 10, but if you go through and you actually count out every time God says thou shalt or thou shalt not, you come up with 14. Now, there's a couple places where they get grouped together. And it makes sense to group them together, but I want to kind of explore why some of them should be considered separately. So first of all, you go through this list, and you notice that there are two commandments that actually involve idols. You shall not make for yourself false idols. You shall not bow before them and worship them. Now, there's a reason why this deserves to be two different commandments. If you go to the book of Daniel, Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you all know them from, Dancing in the Fire or the Beastie Boys song, but they were commanded to bow down and worship an idol of the king of Babylon. Well, if the commandment is just, thou shalt not make for yourself an idol, they didn't do that, so they could have had that cop-out, like, well, I didn't make it, it's okay. But God is quite clear that if you make it or not, if it exists already or if you created it, either way, you can't worship any other god but him. So we group both of those together to be, hey, no idols, bad idea, which is a fair combination, but it kind of short-sights the fullness of our biblical history. Now the next one that actually gets several thou shalls and thou shalt nots is the Sabbath. It says, thou shalt remember the Sabbath. That's important. Then, thou shalt work for 6 days, that's another commandment. And that shall not work on the Sabbath. Technically three commandments. Remember, work, don't work. It starts with remembering. Why do we do something? See, in the Hebrew tradition, remembering why is so important. Remembering the history, remembering those who came before us, those who received the commandment, and those who live out the commandment, that's important. Every Sabbath day they go through, and at nightfall they have a specific prayer and a specific tradition, and they read and remember why they are celebrating the Sabbath. Christians very rarely ever celebrate the Sabbath, and when we do, it's on the wrong day. The Bible never changes the Sabbath from Saturday. But we never remember why. And why do we celebrate the Sabbath? It goes back to verse 2. For I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt. Why do we celebrate what he told us to do? Because he brought us out of Egypt. Why do we not bow down before false idols? Because he is the Lord our God, who brought us out of Egypt. It's the statement of salvation. We remember, we honor, we recognize. That's the first step to the Sabbath. And then we have this pro-work commentary. You got to work. You can't just not work, so you work for 6 days, and then you don't work on one day. But not only you, your family, your slaves, which, by the way, if they were just liberated from slavery, why do they have slaves? That seems, against the spirit of the whole Exodus, but they did, so that's recognized here. But even the slaves and the barn animals and the immigrants amongst them, all of them, everybody and everything needs to rest because the Lord our God created everything and rested, and he was the one that brought us out of Egypt into freedom and into the Holy Land. So we get 2 commandments about idols rather than 1. We get 3 commandments about the Sabbath instead of 1. And then the last numerical discrepancy comes when it comes to coveting. Again, technically, if you count it as a commandment, if God says thou shalt or thou shalt not, then it's commandment. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. That's commandment. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's list of whole other things, list of property, list of possessions. There are a few things listed in possessions that are concerning because people are listed as possessions there, but again, it's an ancient time. So we sum all of that up into just thou shalt not covet anything. And that's really, of all of them, that's the fairest kind of combination. So if you combine all the commandments about the idols, if you combine all the commandments about the Sabbath, and you combine all the commandments about coveting, you end up with 9. Yeah, you see, by the way, pastors have this big fancy term for this. It's called the Decalogue, which the word 10 Commandments is fine, but we feel way cooler when we use fancy words. To get 10 out of those 14 or those 9, you gotta really want it. You gotta really just search for it. So to get 10, you take that 9 combination, but you split out the no other gods, and you combine it with the I am the Lord your God. And that's how we get to 10. So the 10 Commandments are either 9 commandments, 14 commandments, or if you try really hard, it's 10. But what if there were only 2? Let's go through and do a little more math on that and do what they call reduction. Let's reduce this down to its lowest common denominator. I know all of you math people out there are rolling your eyes because I'm completely misusing that term, but follow me here. So our first 4 commandments. I am your God. No idols. Honor the Sabbath. All of those first 4 commandments are engaging in how we interact with God. How do we build a relationship with this divine being? First of all, we don't create idols. Now, idols, especially in the ancient world, were depictions of God, or a God, rather. And it depicted what that God had power over. So, in a few short chapters here, the Israelites all get together and they make an idol of a golden calf because beef is delicious. The ancient world desired that almost as much as we currently desire bacon, but beef was considered to be this statement of opulence, of pure riches. So they make this idol to go through and say, I don't feel fulfilled. I don't feel fulfilled, and I want a God that will bring me something like this idol. Well, is God the God of bringing you hamburgers? Well, if there was ever a God of anything, it would be that. But it's a statement of God is bigger than anything that you could ever try to depict him as. If you try to narrow God's reign of power and his blessings into one image, it would be too limiting. So God says, that's something you don't do with me. Our relationship will be based on how we interact and how we love each other. So the first 4 commandments are how we love and honor God. Now, the last 6 commandments are a very beginning and very incomplete list of social interactions. So back when they were in Egypt, They had Egyptian authorities that would just kind of come through and set down the law. Now that they have to figure this stuff out on their own because they're wandering the desert together, they have to set some ground rules. Ground rules are, don't murder each other. That seems like that should be something we don't have to say, but I kind of feel like we do. But still, that's the basis. Don't murder, don't steal. Don't even covet or desire. Don't desire what other people have. Now, again, this is the foundation for how we love our neighbor. There is a world of difference between asking what and how. What is a very simple answer? What are the commandments? Here are 10 or 14 or 9 or however many. These are the commandments. That's the right answer. What usually has a simple, straightforward answer. Now, when you ask how do we do those things? Things get a little iffy then. We have to have a little more detail, a little more context. So the last 6 commandments are a very simple version of how we love our neighbor. Now I'm cheating on this test because I stole the answers from Jesus. If I haven't said this before, I want you to recognize right now that every good pastor just plagiarizes Jesus. That's all we do. When the legalists came and they asked Jesus, what is the most important commandment? This was kind of a trap. It's kind of a trap to say like, oh, there are 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. That's the what. But Jesus wants to give some context on the how. What is the most important commandment? To love your God and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Jesus is referring to the Decalogue, but he's simplifying it down to 2. You can summarize the first 4 as love your God. You can summarize the last 6 as love your neighbor. And in the book of Matthew, he finishes it with even more eloquence. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Upon this, all the laws and all the prophets are based. In Jesus' mind, there are not 10 commandments. There are not 14. There are not 9. There are not 613. In Jesus' mind, there are but 2. Only 2 commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. Everything else is just a limited, a very confined list on how. And since this book is meant for all people of all time, we can never enumerate all the ways that we could love our neighbor, all the ways that we could love God. So Jesus comes to go through and summarize all 10 of these, all 613 of these, into just those 2 simple statements. I'm going to confuse your math just one last time. We all come to the 10 Commandments filled with previous knowledge, with a history, with a traditional or gut level understanding of them. And that's wonderful because it's a beautiful passage. I don't think there's a single person here that's going to listen to this that doesn't picture Charlton Heston coming down with the tablets. But I want to reframe this one last time. Rather than saying it's any number of commandments, I just want you to think about it this way. There are no commandments here. See, this is the beginning of what they call the covenant of Moses. Covenant is a contractual agreement. You do this, I give you that. Quid pro quo. That whole contractual if-then kind of statement. That's the nature of covenants, and that's the nature of commandments. You do this, you get this. But let's look at what's happening here. The Israelites had just been liberated from Egypt. He is the Lord our God who brought us out of Egypt. What's the promise of God? He will free us from oppression. He'll provide for us. He will sustain us. And he's done that. He started out by doing that. That's the beginning of the book of Exodus. For this entire time, up until this point, and even before that, God has been doing his part. Rather than thinking of these as commandments that we have to follow to receive God's liberation, God's already liberated us. This is not a covenant, this is grace. God's promise was fulfilled before he even brought the commandments. Think about it a different way. Think about it as a more like traditional Jewish way. The word that we translate to commandment is actually mitzvah or mitzvat, which doesn't mean commandment. I'm sure you've heard of like a bat mitzvah. That last part is what this comes from. Now, mitzvah it doesn't mean commandment. It means something that's joyful to do. It brings you joy. It brings you goodness. It brings you growth. And it makes God really happy that you're doing it. I equate it like this. Whenever my daughter sings, that's a mitzvah. She sings and it brings me joy. I love it. She sings and she loves it and she's happier and she's healthier for it. She sings and the world is a better place. I rejoice in that. Did I command her to do it? Did somebody go through and say like, oh, Lily, you have to sing to bring us joy? No. But when you love something, when you love someone, when you love to do something, you naturally live into a life that brings you and them joy. God declares that I am the Lord your God who brought you salvation. That's just the reminder. Our salvation was already bought, was already guaranteed through him and later through Christ. It brings him joy to respond to that salvation. It brings him joy to live into the life of a Christian. It brings us goodness and growth and health and life and vitality. These are not a list of rules for us to follow. This is a description of what a godly life looks like. I gave you freedom, and if you want to live into that freedom, this is how. What is the promise of Jesus Christ? The promise of Jesus Christ is life eternal. How do we receive it? How do we live into that? Again, these mitzvot, these joyful things are just a simple, incomplete list of how we live into the promise of God.